Hello everybody, welcome back to the channel and welcome to this episode where we're going to be painting this Necron that we kit bashed the other week. This is very much a back to basics painting video as I've been really busy moving house and haven't had much time to do much else. But I managed to paint this guy for a commission, so I'm quite happy. The initial brief is that he wanted a slightly metallic black armour, but I really hate painting contrast over metallics. I just don't like the look and I don't like the way the paint doesn't really stick to each other. So I decided to go for a slightly cheaty non-metallic metal. Basically using thin glazes and really pushing that contrast really early, so we're not spending hours on it, but we still get a decent enough effect, especially when we tie in all the other colours and battle damage later. The area that ended up looking the best with this effect was these scarab plates on the back, and I think that's because of how close the panels are to each other, allowing for some really good definition, whereas the main armour panels are quite large and it can be a little bit difficult to make this effect work. As always, it's the final edge highlight that brings everything together and makes it look acceptable, because until this point I wasn't too sure. Another good way to make things look interesting is adding a bit of colour via glazes. In this case I thinned down some Achillean green contrast paint and glazed it into the shadowed areas. After that was done, it was just base coating all the gold. Now, this was specifically requested to be dirty, tarnished gold, so I went with Retributor armour, knowing that I was going to cover it all with Agrax Urshade later. I also did all the other metallics at the same time. I could have done a non-metallic metal here too, but I really wanted to amp that contrast to make the armour look more special and different. The armour had to read as black, not just pure metal, so I went with a pure metal for everything else to really help that differentiate from each other. Does that make sense? I also decided to amp up the contrast even further by just throwing a very, very thin glaze of Leviathan blue into those shadows, just to amp up that Achillean green and make it look slightly weird. It's not overpowering, but it does make it look different, and that's a good thing. Back to the gold, we're now making it that dirty tarnished effect just by slopping Agrax all over. It's not actually what I'm doing. I'm being somewhat careful with it. I'm making sure it's sitting in the recesses, but I do actually want a few patches here and there to make it look like it's been tarnished. This is actually a really satisfying process and is always fun to watch. After I'd done all the same stuff with Nuln Oil, I moved on to the next stage of the painting process. In this case, it was base coating lots and lots of white. Not pure white, I'm using pale grey blue from Vallejo, which is just one of my favourite go-to paints. It's a lot like Celestra Grey from Citadel, but doesn't dry up in the pot and betray me. I used this to base coat those Necron style tassels he's got, the weapon grip, and all of the areas I wanted to be glowing green in a bit. Speaking of green, I used Warp Lightning contrast paint all over the areas I wanted to be glowing. This is an excellent high pigment, high saturation contrast paint, and it's amazing for everything glowing. It's also actually just amazing for green armor. I use it on my salamanders constantly. If you want to see how I paint them, link in the top right. I always find that these stages are the ones that start really pulling together the model and showing it in its almost final form. And that's when you realise you haven't really made a mistake with the armour, because the cool green bits are the main focus. So it's fine. To keep the weapon grip simple, I used some more contrast paint, in this case Basilicanum Grey, which I don't actually use that much, but is useful for stuff like this. As I was painting all these parts, I was considering what colours to use on those tassels he's got hanging by his sides. I'd considered gold, green, and maybe even just leaving it white, because that was cool, but eventually I decided to go slightly left field and use yellow. Why yellow? Because it's a little bit like the gold without actually being more gold, and, you know, it's a bright colour, it's a little bit different. Using spot colours isn't necessarily a bad thing. I don't know if this was the right decision, but ultimately as long as the person who's paying for this is happy, that's what matters, and if they're not, I just repaint it, it's not a problem. Probably shouldn't actually be trying out new colour combinations on a commission, but, you know, I like to live dangerously, I guess. I decided to dot all the little circles with white, just to change things up once again. After all this, I thinned down some moot green really thin to a wash consistency and allowed it to drip into all the recesses on all the weapons and all over the armour. This was a really cool step. Not only was it satisfying, but it really helped the miniature pop and gave a nice glow effect without really much effort at all. Now you don't see it here, but I did also go in with some livery green just to really brighten up those areas where the lines intersect, or where there are really long lines, just to change up that colour ever so slightly. It's very subtle, but it helps that glow effect nicely. You also can't have a proper power weapon without some edge highlighting, so I used that moot green to give my initial layer, and then went in with livery green to sharpen it up afterwards. This has always been my favourite method of painting power weapons, green or otherwise. If you're going to do blue, use Achillean green, which is actually blue. If you're going to do red, go in with Blood Angel's red, or, thin down some Khorne red. It's always a great method of making the weapons really saturated, and then you just go in with some very bright edge highlights after the fact. It makes it look really sharp and really colourful. What more could you want? Oh, blood. Well, if you're going to do blood, maybe don't do these bright colours, just do metal and slap blood all over them. We should do a video about bloody weapons. Back on topic, we're now highlighting all the gold with Liberator Gold. I don't always highlight my metallics. In fact, when it comes to the regular metals, those silvers and aluminium style colours, I don't highlight them. It's a little bit lazy on my part, but I honestly just don't think it looks much better. I'm quite happy with it as it is. Controversial opinion, maybe. Starting to look at finishing up the model now, I come in with some Administratum Grey, which is a very bright grey that's almost white. I use this colour to add some edge highlighting and battle damage. I'm being very deliberate with where I place the battle damage, usually on the larger areas that don't have much detail on, and I find if you contrast it with a really dark paint, in this case the armour's black, so it's great, it looks even better. Compared to some of my other battle damage, this is really light touch, just to make it look like it's been dinged by a few rocks or some dust, or maybe even a las bolt or two. Honestly, for this guy, nothing major. With all this, the main model is now complete, and we can move on to the base, which I kept very simple, but I think is still going to be quite effective for this entire composition. I base coated the rocks on the base with Mechanicus Standard Grey, and then I dry brushed some pale grey blue on top. After that was the fun part, where I used Agrax Earthshade, Athonian Camo Shade, and Druchii Violet. Using a dabbing motion with the brush, I added little pools of this all over the rocks, so this can look a little bit like moss, general rock texture. You'll find if you look at some rocks, they have loads of different colours in. You could add blues, you can add whatever. I mean, I added purple here, and it looks absolutely fine. After the entire process was done, I used Nuln Oil in a thin layer all over the top. Again, these rocks are predominantly grey, so this is just to tie everything together. Mostly off camera, I also added a glow effect to the crystal at the front in the exact same way that I did the weapons and all the orbs all over the model. I had quite a good time painting this guy. I don't usually paint Necrons, so it was a really interesting experience. Let me know what you think. Thank you to everyone who's watched this video, and thank you to all my channel members, both new and old. I've been Sam. See you next time.